guys, it's me. And as you see, I'm back in the house. And what are you doing at 7 o'clock on a Tuesday night? Probably not this, but that's okay. It's what I do. And so today we're going to talk about the Great Depression. Probably the biggest factor that ended the chance of world peace was this thing called the Great Depression. Now, as old as you might think I am, I did not live through the Great Depression. My parents did. And they talked about it in very hushed tones. That it was a time when, and both my parents grew up poor in rural Alabama, and it was a time when they, being poor, were made much poorer by this incident. Living at the bottom of the trickle down barrel, when nothing's trickling down, things get really rough. So anyway. After World War I, many of the nation's economies went into a slump. Britain and France's economy depended tenuously on the ability of Germany to make these war reparation payments, which were unreasonable and the Germans could not. Even in the United States, much of the Roaring Twenties income was shared by only a small percentage of the population. In fact, during the 1920s, the so-called Roaring Twenties, 70% of the U.S. population lived below the poverty line. You say, well, how does that compare with today? Well, today, I mean, that percentage is probably more in the neighborhood of between 7 and 10%, depending on how you measure things. Products produced in factories were unaffordable by the great majority of the population. Factories laid off workers. Farmers overproduced. And farming is the only kind of profession I know of that you can do really well and then lose money. And they overproduced and they lost their farms because the way farming worked back then, in the beginning of the year, you borrowed money from the bank to buy seed and your other supplies. And then at the end of the harvest, you paid the bank back. But in the meantime, to guarantee that loan, you had to mortgage your farm. And so if you could not then make the debt, the bank foreclosed on your farm and you lost your farm. So as it says there, when the farms were foreclosed, the banks folded because they didn't have money to cover their loans. In 1929, because too many stock investors had over-speculated. A good word, over-speculated. What does that mean? Basically, it means that, speculation is the first word. What does speculation mean? Speculation is when you purchase something, not to use, but in anticipation that the value of that something will increase. And when it does increase, you then sell that something for the increased value and you make a profit. And that's how the stock market works. The problem is you are constantly, running a balancing game between knowing when to sell and when to buy. You buy low, you sell high. Well, that sounds easy enough, but it's not. Because the stock market, the economy, is like the weather. The weather is unpredictable, as we are seeing tonight, because it's going to snow tonight. Yeah, we're at the end of April and it's going to snow. Today it was 66 degrees and tonight it is going to snow. Now that is, if you understand that, then you understand something about the nature of the economy and the stock market. So, when the prices of those stocks dropped, everyone who had invested in those stocks tried to sell the stock, further driving down the price of the stock and depressing the market. And the problem was compounded by the fact that many people bought stock on margin. You say, what does that mean? Well, in the 20s, it was legal to go to a bank, borrow money, take the money, and buy stock with it. And then the idea is, of course, the stock market's going to keep going up and up and up. You sell off the stock, you pay the bank, and you have profit. It's a nice pyramid scheme until eventually the pyramid crumbles, which always happened. And on October 29, 1929, a record of 16 million stocks were sold. And what that meant was there was a downward spiral of the stock market crash that just kept feeding on itself. Many people lost their entire paper fortunes, and that's all they were. Buying stock is just a paper fortune. And tomorrow during class, I'm going to talk about what the difference is between stocks and bonds. In the short, when you buy a stock, you're actually buying a portion of ownership of a company, of an enterprise. Now, and so if the value of that company increases, then the value of your stock increases by the same percentage. You then sell that ownership and you get profit or not. But if the value of that company decreases, then you could lose everything you invest, literally. Bonds are different. Bonds are loans, normally made to some kind of government entity. For example, this country in the past has sold war bonds. When the United States was at war in World War I and World War II, needed money, they sold war bonds and people bought the war bonds. And the way war bonds work is that the bonds have a set rate of interest. So that when after, say, 5 years, you go back and you return the bonds, you receive the money that you loan the government plus a rate of interest. You never lose your money with bonds, but also the rate of return is much lower. So, the Great Depression was one of the greatest, most far-reaching economic calamities this world has ever seen. By 1932, factory production around the world had been cut in half. 9 million people in the United States alone lost their savings in banks. And by 1933, 1/4 of Americans, 25%, had no jobs. And not only that, the remaining 75% who had jobs had to accept pay decreases or had to live on fewer hours of work. And it made people very much afraid. And that American crash quickly spread around the world. The United States Congress passed an act demanding high tariffs so that American money would stay home. That move backfired because all the other countries imposed their own tariffs. World trade dropped by 65%. That's a lot. Unemployment rates soared around the world. Germany and Austria, because they were on the losing side in World War I, were particularly hard hit. Each of the European countries dealt with the depression in their own way. Great Britain elected a multi-party coalition called the National Front that passed high protective tariffs, lowered interest rates, increased taxes, and thereby regulated the currency. They went back on the gold standard. By 1937, in Britain, unemployment had been cut in half and production had risen above 1929 levels. That is a deceiving statistic because, in actuality, in the 1920s, British economy had not been doing that well. And so when it says they rose above 1929 levels, doing better than terrible is still terrible. France, unlike Britain, had a self-sustaining economy. By 1935, 1 million French workers were unemployed. By 1933, 5 coalition French governments had formed and fell. In 1936, a coalition of moderate socialists and communists that was called the Popular Front ruled France. And this government passed a series of reforms to help workers. Unemployment in France remained high. Socialist governments in operated in the Scandinavian countries like Sweden, Denmark, and Norway. These works were publicly funded, raised the pensions, increased unemployment insurance, increased subsidies for housing, and other welfare benefits. But to pay for this, taxes on all citizens were increased. The United States in 1932 elected FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt will be the president of the United States from 1932 to 1945. And he came in on the policy, on the promise that he was going to give America a new deal, a new economic program, a recovery from the Depression. And he made a lot of strides. For example, the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, which built a series of dams on the Tennessee River, which provided hydroelectricity to much of the Deep South. For example, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corps, which planted trees in many of the eroded hillsides of the Southern Appalachians. For example, WPA, Works Progress Administration, which did public works such as building the steps at the Cincinnati Zoo. Uh, yeah, I mean, and so yeah, democracy in America were never really threatened. Ah, yes, Sacco and Vanzetti. But there's an old saying, it's the economy, stupid. And when the economy gets bad, people become angry. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants who were accused of, in the process of robbing a payroll from some company, killing the payroll guard. There was no evidence against them, except they were Italian immigrants, and they were convicted. So, millions of people throughout Europe and Japan lost faith in the slow moving wheels of democracy and embraced more authoritarian forms of government. While fascism did not embrace any planned out ideas, as did communism, it did follow certain dogmatic ideas. Extreme loyalty to one's country, and the idea that all nations must struggle as peaceful states were doomed to be conquered. Loyalty to an authoritarian leader who brought order to the state. Fascists did not seek a classless society like the communists did. However, like the communists, they did not recognize individual rights. They allowed only their party to participate in government. In Italy, a newspaper publisher by the name of Benito Mussolini promised to rescue Italy, who as a nation felt that they'd been cheated by the World War I Treaty of Versailles. Benito Mussolini was an interesting character. He was thrown out of school when he was 8 years old. Now, you might ask, what can an 8-year-old do to get thrown out of school? Oh, I don't know. Try. They couldn't get him to stop stabbing all of his classmates with a knife. Yeah. And so, yeah, he got thrown out of school when he was 8. Mussolini played on the fears of a working class revolt and won the support of the middle class, the aristocracy, and the industrial workers. What does "he made the trains run on time" mean? That's the favorite saying about Benito Mussolini. You see, Mussolini took over Italy, and when he took over Italy, Italy was a mess. The army has a nasty term for the state of affairs in Italy, and we won't say it here, but it's pretty accurate. Uh, Before Mussolini, for example, the trains in Italy before Mussolini, it was simply accepted that if a train pulled into the station on the same day it was scheduled to pull into the station, then I mean the train was considered to be on time. Now you and I know that's no way to run a railroad. I mean trains, like buses, like ships, like airplanes, depart pretty much on the minute and arrive. Well, Mussolini, when he became the Il Duce, which is Italian, it means the leader, Il Duce. When he became Il Duce, he said, I have a simple solution. Next time a train is late, and it arrives at its destination later than its appointed time, the next time it is late, we take the conductor off the train and shoot him. And that only had to happen a few times before, guess what? Trains ran on time. Now, that's effective, but Is that really what you want? He outlawed strikes by workers. He censored the newspapers. Was his control as complete as that of Hitler and Joseph Stalin? No. No, not at all. Now, let's talk about this guy named Adolf. Um, he is probably the most famous person in the 20th century. Oh, yeah, I'd have to say that. I mean, you can go anywhere and say, hey, Hitler, and people know exactly who you're talking about. Where was he from? First of all, he was not German, technically. He was Austrian. And he had served in World War One. He was wounded because his gas mask did not fit very well over his Germanic mustache, and he did suffer injury from that. He was the son of an Austrian paper hanger, and he joined a group known as the NDSAP, the National German Socialist Workers' Party, which is what that stands for. Nationalistische Deutsche Sozialistische Arbeitspartei. Yes. And which was later shortened to Nazi, which was later shortened to, you guessed it, Nazi. And his title became Der Führer, which in German means the same thing, the leader. And by the way, this right here, yeah, there we go. This right here, Heil Hitler. Hitler's Germany, he felt that his Germany was the new Roman Empire. And if you remember anything about the Romans, when the Caesar entered the room, everyone extended their arms and said the words, Hail Caesar. Now you look at that and you see the similarity. Extended arm, yeah, same thing. What did Hitler define as Aryans? The idea of Aryans was actually an idea that was it was old as Charles Darwin. Darwin had come up with this idea of natural selection. The idea that some species were selected by nature to survive, some species selected to thrive, and other species selected for extermination. Well, social Darwinists believe that the same thing applied to ethnicities of humans, that some ethnicities were created so that they survive, other ethnicities dominate, and yet other ethnicities were selected by nature to be eliminated. And so, yeah, Adolf Hitler thought that the Germans, who were, yes, and the Germans actually could claim that they were part of a race of people who actually had lived in Asia about 25,000 years ago that paleontologists call Aryans. And 25,000 years ago, these Aryans scattered. Some went south into India, some went southwest into Asia Minor, and yes, some went into Europe. And Hitler, of course, assumed that those guys were blonde, tall, blonde, blue eyed. Yeah, that they were Germans and they were unpolluted by other races. And so he explores this in a book he wrote called Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle, a book that he wrote while he was put in jail for trying to stage a insurrection in a beer hall in Munich. The word Lebensraum is German. It literally means living space. And Lebensraum fit into this whole in Mein Kampf because Adolf Hitler said that the Aryans, since they were superior, needed space. And the space he was talking about was not just all of Germany, but also all of Poland, all of the Ukraine, into Russia, the Soviet Union, because a dominant people, a superior people, need to populate as much as they can. You say, well, what about the people who live there already? Well, they were going to have to move one way or the other. Why was Adolf Hitler in prison? Like I said, he tried to stage an insurrection. If I don't say this anywhere else, the strength of people like Adolf Hitler and Mussolini and even Lenin was that they appeared at a time of crisis. They promised these desperate people exactly what they wanted to hear. They told them that whatever was happening to you is not your fault, gave them promises of security. And so in 1933, Hitler was elected to the position of Chancellor of Germany. A mentally deranged person, a Dutch communist, had set fire to the Reichstag, the national legislature, which Hitler managed to blame on all communists, which made communists unpopular. This also gave the Nazis a slight majority in the Reichstag. Now, what was der Schutzstaffel? The SS, and it means protective force. Heinrich Himmler was chosen to be the leader of the Schutzstaffel. Hermann Goering was on Hitler's executive staff too. He was the director of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Corps. The new laws, the Nuremberg laws, and strikes, dissolved labor unions, gave the government the authority over business and labor. He did put millions of Germans back to work. Yeah, which of course made people believe in it. Hitler controlled the following segments of German life: press, literature, radio, film, into propaganda, producing a propaganda film called Die Ewige Jude, the Eternal Jew. Books were burned, and he formed a group called the Hitler Youth. And he said, what's the Hitler Youth? The Hitler Youth, I'm going to tell you, if you went and looked at it and you took away the little swastikas the kids wore and things of that nature, you would say, hey, look, this is the Boy Scouts. Because that's just basically what they did. They, practiced survival skills, athletics. They learned about good citizenship and, personal cleanliness and racial hatred. And so, yeah, League of German Girls, same thing, except that they learn about the womanly arts, which they couldn't learn the manly arts. So then, of course, there was the Nazi attempt to rid Europe of the Jewish population, to make Europe Judenrein. As it says there, this came from a misguided belief that Jews were corrupting influences on society, and Hitler made them the blame for many of Germany's problems. What other groups ended up in concentration camps? Jews were the biggest minority, but also the Roma, gypsies, also people with physical and mental challenges, such as children with Down syndrome, for example. I mean, when the Nazis first took over, they identified children who had these situations. And the Nazi officials, doctors, would show up at the house of these parents and say that they were going to take the child away to a hospital where they would receive expert care. And the child was never heard from again. And about 2 or 3 weeks after the child had been taken away, they would receive a letter saying that the child became ill and had unfortunately died, Sieg Heil, or something like that. And when Jews began disappearing, Jewish synagogues caught on fire, newspapers got shut down, the guys down the street that you knew were homosexuals started disappearing. Nobody said anything. Why? Because people got their jobs back. Yes, Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht it means the night of broken glass. It was a night in 1935 when the Nazi party just went nuts on anything Jewish. And finally, in Eastern Europe, Hungary, Poland, Yugoslavia, Albania, Bulgaria, and Romania became dictatorships, and only Czechoslovakia remained democratic. And we are going to stop here, and I'll pick up tomorrow. And look, though, it's about the Japanese. We get to see our film again. All right, so let me put this down here, and let me put this down here, and let's stop the recording.